Okay, so as the participants are coming into the room, let me start this session, the 7th already edition of Digital Underground Connect from Singapore, but really reaching out to all of you all over the world. Our fourth all virtual session. So now we have more virtual sessions than in-person sessions, and so far we are not changing anytime soon. So good morning, or good afternoon, or even a good evening or night to you. A warm welcome on behalf of myself, as well as Jakub and Dr. Geoff Zeiss. So today, we will not talk about the unlocking the value of digital ground information, but we will talk about the quality of underground utility information. And we hope to provide you an interesting and engaging session in which we talk about how we can improve the quality of subsurface utility information to reduce utility strikes, but also potentially for other benefits. I will kick off the session with a brief update from Digital Underground Connect. Then, as soon as possible, we will move on to the main, the headliner of today, which is the talk by Geoff Zeiss. And then we will follow up with a Q&A, as well as a short discussion session with the audience and the speaker to conclude this session. So before we introduce ourselves properly, let me share some practical notes with you. We are on a webinar platform called Demio. Most important for you to know is that there's a chat area on the right side. I see that some of you have already found it, where you can chat, post your comments, your questions, or whatever comes to mind. And you are very much encouraged to do so, to engage with us as well as with the other people in the audience. Should anything go wrong, we usually just recommend to do a refresh of your page, and usually things will go back to normal again. So let's hope that everything will be all right and we'll have a smooth session today. A brief introduction from our side. So there's two of the Digital Underground Connect leadership team here today. So that is Jakub. Jakub, would you like to briefly introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jakub Wachowski. I'm Director for Industry Advancement for Bentley Institute of Bentley Systems. And we're looking forward to having some exciting conversations today. Later on, I'm going to be leading and moderating the discussions. So please feel free to jump in and also start to, fantastic, I see people starting to present themselves. So we're looking forward to those discussions and to the presentation by Geoff.
All right, thank you, Jakub. And so my name is Rob van Son. I'm project lead of a project called Digital Underground here in Singapore, the Singapore ETH Center. Probably also in the audience with us are Dr. Victor Koop, who's Director of Survey and Geomatics Division at SLA here in Singapore, and the main sponsor of the Digital Underground project. And recently joining us is Mr. Chua from the SISV, the Singapore Institute of Surveyors and Valuers. Very important that we have them here, the professionals that are responsible for producing the good quality information that we all depend on. Who you are, we usually do this, right? So I made a quick overview of where you're all from. So as we can see, we are based in Singapore, and we're very happy to see many Singaporeans join this session. At the same time, also happy to see, again, a steady group from the UK. Very happy to see you here, as well as some other good representations from, the same or similar time zones, Japan and Australia, as well as some European places. Good spread. If you're that one person from Paraguay, I congratulate you for joining this session, because you're literally at the other side of the world, and I'm very happy if you could actually make it. In the meantime, you may have noticed I have launched a poll to get some insights in the, not only where you are from, but what you are doing and how you interact with utility information. I see some answers pouring in. Interestingly, so far, I see we have mostly people that use the information or need the information for their work. So I can imagine they are maybe engineering consultants or contractors working in the field. But good to see also representation from surveying, as well as the management of the data and the regulation and solution development side. So welcome all. Glad to have you here. So this is what I usually do, and I'll keep this short because I know a lot of you already know this. What is Digital Underground Connect about, right? We are a community of practice based and originating from Singapore, but with a global outreach about meeting and learning and improving for the sake of getting better information of the underground. Our community is all about learning, all about exchanging knowledge and insight so we can all get better. And at the same time, also just have a good time, meet each other in a safe and comfortable space as we discuss these very exciting and important issues. We have the four organizations supporting, right? So SEC from my side, SLA, Bentley Institute, Digital Advancement Academies, and the SISV here in Singapore. A brief recap. So far we've had 7. We are now at the 7th session, right? So we've constantly been hovering between ground geotechnical information and utility information. And we understand that both are very important to make good decisions about what you do with the underground. Last session was about digital ground information, geotechnical information, how technology could help to share that information, where we learned a few lessons. Just to summarize, that data sharing currently still mostly occurs within companies, but that we see that there's a huge potential enabled by technology to now share information beyond the scope of a project or a company, even on a regional or national level. You probably need the government to take a leading or visionary role in all of this to make this happen, to also encourage private companies to share their data as they also benefit from ingesting more data into their systems. And interestingly, even when we talk about sharing, we always talk about quality as well. And that's why I'm so happy that we have today's session again about information quality, is that, you know, even when data is available, it doesn't always mean it's right. It still doesn't exempt you from doing your proper work to investigate on site. We are consolidating all the insights that we learn, that we capture during these sessions on our website, DUConnect.org. So please do check it out. If you're interested to learn more, there are summaries available, some video recordings, sometimes even the full webinar. So, and as you may have noticed, there's also a reason to celebrate, because we are actually 1 year old. So this is, you know, now it's October. We started out in October, so every 2 months, and then, okay, by the time number 7 arrives, you're 1 year into the future. So yeah, this is a 1 year birthday for us, for Digital Underground Connect, and also, you know, of course, to you as the audience, being part of the community. Very happy that we're still going strong, even when the world has changed quite a bit in the meantime. You know, from us starting all the way back at the Bentley facility with around maybe 20, 30 people joining us, to, you know, the very lively community with sometimes hundreds of people joining in the conversation from all around the world to discuss these issues, which are obviously important, not just to Singapore, but also to many other places, people, and organizations. So congratulations to you all. If you have any birthday wishes or any good memories or anything else that you would like to share with us, please feel free to do so in the chat, or if not, you know, we have reserved a little place in our post-session feedback form, so you're very welcome to do. And if they're good, right? I mean, you may also wish us to end this right now. We're very open to any kind of feedback. If you think 1 year is just about enough, but we like to consolidate some of these comments as well, and like to know what you think. So thank you for that. Thank you all for your support, and of course, we'll keep going strong. So that brings us to today's session, which is about improving the quality of subsurface utility information. And I'll do a brief introduction to explain why we think this is important. Right, so one question that always comes back in every session that we've had so far is about quality. How do you actually ensure that the data that you get is of the sufficient degree of quality, and how can we ensure that people follow the rules? So two interesting examples. Bottom left, you see on the top right of that image, you see something that resembles a stick, or maybe a cane, right? We use a cane here in Singapore, and supported by enforcement, right? So how can we ensure that people follow the rules that are set out? And then on the bottom right, from a LinkedIn user quite recently, who said again, digital is great except when it's wrong. So again, quality is super important to ensure that data is good, that we understand how good or how bad something is, etc. And of course, for Singapore, as you may know, right, we don't actually have so much utility strikes. On the bottom right, you can see one that quite recently happened, but usually it's not considered a big problem. We are more interested in optimizing underground space use, in supporting construction projects, of which there are many going on all the time in the city-state. Nonetheless, we have, of course, observed that many other places in the world have efforts ongoing aimed at reducing damages to underground utilities by providing data and by improving the quality. And of course, what connects us here, Singapore and the rest of the world, is really that we're all interested in understanding what is where exactly underground. And regardless of the use case, I think we all need good quality information, regardless of what you want to do with it. And that's why I'm very happy to have Geoff here. So we will move on to the main talk, which is titled "Reducing the Risk of Underground Utility Damage Improves Construction Productivity" by Geoff Zeiss. So Geoff, let me briefly introduce you before I'll hand over the floor to you. So Geoff tracks the contribution of geospatial technology to the digitalization of the construction and energy industries on his Between the Poles blog and other media. His area of special focus is locating, mapping, and sharing information about underground utility infrastructure. A white paper called "Reducing Damage to Underground Utility Infrastructure During Excavation," prepared by Geoff and Dr. Sakura Shinoaki, was recently released by GITA, or GITA. In recognition of his efforts to increase the awareness of geospatial data and technologies in utilities and construction, Geoff received the Geospatial Ambassador Award at Geospatial World Forum 2014 in Geneva, Switzerland. And he's also a member of the Digital Underground project of our advisory board. And he actively supports open standards as a director of the OGC, the Open Geospatial Consortium. That's where Geoff's biography ends, and I just want to add a few more words to that, because, Geoff, we're very happy to have you here. Sometimes when I talk about you to others, I jokingly call you a bit of a social media influencer, and I mean that in the best sense of the word, right? We're in a very technical, almost niche kind of world, but if anyone is considered an authority on, globally, I think a lot of people think about you when it comes to utility mapping, but also making data available. And I think many of us in the field really appreciate what you've been doing in the past years or so, tirelessly capturing all kinds of things going on all over the world related to underground utility information, but also geotechnical information. And I think we're just very happy to have you here. Very interested to hear what you have to say about the subject of information quality on underground utilities. Just a quick note to the audience is that if you have any questions, please do enter them into the chat. We will tag them as moderators as questions to be handled later during the Q&A. So thank you for that. And with that, Geoff, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Rob. And I'd like to thank Victor and the Singapore Land Authority for this whole initiative, Digital Underground. I think it's remarkable and it's really a model for the world. I think everybody around the world is aware of what is going on in Singapore because it's open and because of things like DUConnect. This talk, for any of you, I've noticed a couple of technical folks. Locus, I noticed Locus View is on the call, Impulse Radar, and I'm sure there's others that are on the call. This talk will depart from what I've typically done in the past, in that I will spend virtually no time on the technology. What I'm interested in covering is the social effort, put in a very general terms, social effort to improve the quality of information about the underground. 2 or 3 years ago, I would have just said the social effort to increase awareness about what is underground. But at this point, I think awareness has become very widespread, and I think we're seeing a lot of different jurisdictions doing things in different ways. And what I'd like to talk about, and not, over the years, I've collected probably 25 to 30 different information about 25 to 30 jurisdictions around the world that have attempted to do this. And this included in Malaysia, it's included Europe, it's included North America. There's some parts of the world where I just have not spent enough time to see what is going on, and that includes China, for example. But I think there are a lot of things going on around the world from the point of view organizationally, how to collect and share information about the underground. There's a lot of effort going into collecting information about the underground. Every construction project involves collecting information about the underground, but very often that information is actually not shared. And so you can go and dig a hole in the same place year after year, and the same information is collected and basically lost. And I think that is something that is changing, and I'll talk about some of the efforts worldwide to do that. First of all, let me just put a little bit of context for this. One of the big problems in virtually all the advanced economies around the world, whether we're talking about South Korea, Japan, EU, UK, North America, Canada, US, construction productivity plateaued about 50 years ago. In other words, it has not improved. General productivity, industrial productivity has more than doubled over that period of time. So an automobile worker or an airplane manufacturing worker produces twice as many planes or cars now than they did 40 or 50 years ago. In construction, they're producing pretty much the same as what they produced 50 years ago. In some jurisdictions, it's actually gotten worse. They're producing less than what they produced. And this is a big problem. And one of the reasons it's a big problem is because there's more and more issues with major projects and other types of projects. These are some of the statistics from, this is North America, showing some of the problems with construction projects. And as if you're familiar with any major construction projects, you realize that there's a high probability that they are going to go, they're going to be delayed, and that they are going to go over budget. This is an overview of some of the problems with the construction industry. I think, as you're aware, there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of contractors who do very specialized work. This is not a business of 3 or 4 big companies who do everything. There are thousands and thousands of small contractors. It tends to be adversarial. As a friend of mine said, that when you do construction, you spend half your time actually doing the engineering, and you spend the other half of the time in litigation. It's characterized by low margins. In the UK, for example, I think that the top 10 construction contractors with an annual turnover of something on the order of 30 billion has a margin of 0.35%. You wonder why anybody does construction with margins like that. They certainly wouldn't build airplanes and cars with margins like that. One thing that's interesting about construction is given those low margins, the construction industry pays significant insurance costs. And if those insurance costs could be reduced, that would contribute significantly to improving their margins. These are some numbers that I got recently from an insurance company in the U.S. that estimated that for a contractor with annual turnover of 25 to 40 billion, they would be paying $1 million in insurance premium. So that is that's percentages of their turnover. And given their low margins, it would be really beneficial if there was a way of reducing the risk of damage, which would in turn translate into reduced insurance premiums. So that gives you a little bit of context for the insurance company and why this for the insurance industry and why this is important. The other thing about utility damage is that it's expensive. It's financially expensive or economically expensive, but it also costs lives and it also costs injuries. These are some numbers from around the world. The 50 to 100 billion annually in the U.S. is my estimate based on numbers from the CGA and some research in the UK. In the UK, it's harder to put a number, but it's estimated that we're talking about billions of pounds. I think if you prorate it from the UK, from the US, for example, assuming the UK is about 60, something like 20% of the US population, you can figure out what that number might be. And in the Netherlands, they've estimated there's something on the order of $1 billion. The really interesting thing is whether these numbers include not only direct costs, in other words, what does it cost to repair the pipe, but indirect costs, loss of custom, disrupted traffic, insurance costs, cost of litigation, and there's a long list of indirect costs that are associated with this that are usually not included in these figures. Just to give you an example of two really important incidents, this happened in Belgium in 2004. I'm sure that any folks on the line from Europe will remember this. This was just a devastating experience, and it was one of the reasons why in Flanders and in the Netherlands there are now sites that are dedicated to sharing information about the underground. It's called CLIP, K-L-I-P in Flanders, and it's called CLIC or KLIC in the Netherlands. And I'll talk about CLIC a little later. But this was a devastating experience. And one thing you'll find through this entire talk is that when there is a disaster like this, often government steps in and things happen very rapidly thereafter. And I'll give you 2 or 3 examples where that has happened. This is a really important one. This has happened in Firestone, Colorado. This also led to legislation. This happened in 2017, and by 2019 there was really radically new legislation in Colorado, and I'll talk about that. It led to a couple of deaths and a serious injury, and it was caused by actually a 1-inch natural gas flow line from an Endarco gas well. Now you may say that, well, this is just the way things are. There's things that are underground. We don't know where they are. We try to do things. We try to dig carefully. We try to take other measures to reduce that risk, but that's just the way business is. And if you look at the Netherlands, or if you look at the US, or if you look at the UK, the statistics are similar. We're in the Netherlands, we're talking about 41,000 incidents every year. I mean, that's a small country, but very densely populated. In the US, the number of incidents, the actual number of incidences are somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million. There's some disagreement about what that number actually is, but it's a lot. It's at least 1 to 2 every minute. The number I show here, 390,000, is what's reported to the Common Ground Alliance. It's not mandatory to report that, so that's voluntary reporting. And I've just compared it with Japan. And you may say, well, you left off some zeros or something like that, but I haven't. And I know there's an issue of whether we're talking about apples and oranges here because there's different classifications of what an incident or whatever. But when we're talking about numbers like this, we're really, I think the important message here is that Japan has managed to do something about that. And I'll also talk about Heathrow Airport, where they have also managed to do that, and they have statistics that carry, from about 2003, which show a steady decline in the number of incidents, no matter how you define them, at Heathrow. So I think the important message is that something can be done about this, and I'll try in this talk to give you some indication, not from a technical point of view, but from the point of view of organization of how to achieve something like that. There's a number of use cases that relate to how underground information can be used. Some of these were defined by Singapore. Some of them were defined in the UK as part of the National Underground Asset Registry project. But these are just a few of them. Of course, street excavation is the obvious one, but this information is also very important for emergency response. You may want to know what's underwater. You may want to know what has been impacted by a flood, for example. Utility maintenance is obviously very important to know where things are underground. If you have an outage somewhere and you want to know what caused it and you want to go find that piece of equipment, you can either, in Canada, for example, you can wander around in the snow looking for it because the accuracy of as-built is pretty poor here, and you have to use other means to try to find it. Large-scale construction projects need to know where these things are because they often have to do relocations. If you're doing a highway project, for example, a rail project, you have to relocate some utilities to make way for your project. It's obviously useful for disaster planning, smart cities, digital twins, strategic urban planning, and I could go on. But those are just a few of them. In this talk, I'm going to be concentrating on street excavation, utility maintenance, and large-scale construction projects. And that was really the focus of the newer project in the UK. So what I'd like to now do is to go through some of the some of the initiatives that I'm aware of worldwide that are indicating what people are doing to solve this problem. And there's really two aspects to this. One is, what do we do to record the location of new infrastructure as we put it in the ground? This, in the past, has generated what are called as-built. And in many parts of the world, those are not really as-built. Those are as-designs. And so what actually goes in the ground is not what's recorded on the as-built. And that is one of the real sources of major problems. The other aspect of this is, where is the existing infrastructure and how can we improve the quality of our location information about existing infrastructure? And I'll talk about some of the ways that some of the organizations are trying to do that. Just to give you some context for this that I mentioned at the beginning, it's estimated in the US that something like $10 billion is spent annually finding things underground. And as I said at the beginning, this information is rarely shared. It's usually recorded for the project, but after the project completes, that information is lost. And if you come and do a project involving excavation in the same place, pretty much the same process will happen. You'll call the one call center, people will come out with their magic wands and GPR push carts, and they will try to find all that stuff again. They'll paint the ground, and that can happen year after year. And that is a real waste of $10 billion. A number of jurisdictions around the world have tried to deal with this problem. These are just a few of them that I'm aware of. I won't go through all of these at all, but this is worldwide, where people have recognized the problem and are trying to do it. I will mention that Tokyo was one of the first that tried to do something about this with a system called RODIS, or it was actually the Road Information Center, RODIC, but the system was called Road Information System. I guess the way I would put it is that if Moses stuck his staff in the ground in Tokyo, he'd hit a lot more than water. He'd hit telecommunications, electric power, a lot of underground infrastructure, and it's the same thing if he stuck his shaft in the ground in Heathrow Airport, and we'll come to that later. there's different ways that that people are organizing the sharing of information. In some jurisdiction, the government just comes in and says, you have to do this. And PHMSA in the United States is an example, and I'll spend some time on that. But there's examples around the world, of other examples around the world, where it's basically government mandate. Thou shalt do this. In some cases, it's government voluntary. Scotland, for example, the Scottish vault system was originally, and still is government sponsored, but it's voluntary. The utility operators don't have to do. They're not required by law to do this. After the legislation has been passed in the Scottish Parliament to make this mandatory, but as of right now, it is still voluntary. There are consortia. There's an interesting consortia in British Columbia, not specifically for excavation damage in underground, where it's just a bunch of utilities got together and said it would really be good to share this information. There's also industry associations. For example, the Common Ground Alliance in North America is an industry association, and more recently, the Utility Strike Avoidance Group in the UK is doing something similar to what the Common Ground Alliance is doing in the US, and it's voluntary. There are mandated call before you dig. This is typical of all of North America. Just about all the states and provinces in Canada have mandated one call, and there's this legislation that mandate it. It doesn't cost the government anything because it's usually paid for by the network operators, as they are required to become members of the one call center, and they are required to pay dues. The click in the Netherlands is also one call, government mandated, and CLIP in not in Belgium, actually in Flanders, is also government mandated. There are private call before you dig companies. Line Search Before You Dig in the UK is a private company. It's owned by Pelican Corp and another company. And if you've probably heard of Pelican Corp, which is runs one call centers in Australia, US, UK, and I believe in Singapore. And then there's regulatory rules, basically regulatory organizations that specify rules, like for any regulatory organization, represents the public and specifies rules of what thou should do and what thou shouldn't do. And I'll give some examples from Montana and recent examples from Montana and Colorado. There's a very recent effort by Ofwat in England and Wales to improve the quality of information about the underground, and there are other examples. And it's not totally clear right now what's going to happen in the UK, because they're in the process of preparing an invitation to tender for the NUAR project, which will be a England and Wales way of sharing information, and it's not totally clear how that's going to be organized at this point. Now, let's just give one example of a government-mandated system, and that is PHMSA. This was, again, originated, what motivated in this first place were several incidents of gas lines exploding and killing people in the US, and the government moved very quickly and defined something called high consequence areas, which required fairly intricate GIS analysis to figure out what each utility had to do, gas utility had to do. But this cost gas utilities quite a lot of money. This gives you some idea of the size of this organization. They have a budget of around 255 million. Which may seem like a lot, but I'll come later to, if you compare this, for example, to the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States, which is tasked with reducing incidents of aviation crashes, this is a drop in a puddle. The really good thing about this, about PHMSA, is that it collects reliable statistics. In other words, incidents of damage and leakage. This is not just construction damage, but to any kind of leakage involving pipeline. Federally regulated pipelines have to be reported to PHMSA, and it includes quite a lot of information. It includes the volume of product release, the number of fatalities, injuries, costs, and cause. So this is probably the ideal of the kind of information you would want to collect for these kinds of incidents. And then they publish statistics starting in around 2005, and these are some of the statistics specifically for excavation incidents over that period of time. And you can see, they can tell you that there was 1,000 incidents, there were 48 fatalities, 195 injuries, and $500 million of property damage. So that's very useful information. And you can get similar information from the CLIC system in the Netherlands, for example. Now, this is a very recent initiative. This, I think, began only about a year ago. This is in Montana. It's basically a regulatory rule that specifies that you have to do an as-built survey, accurate to about 1/3 of a foot. Okay, so that's about 3 or 4 inches. That's about 6 or somewhere between 6 and 8 centimeters. And most importantly, it has to be certified by a professional engineer or a professional land survey. And to put it bluntly, that means there's somebody you can sue. Okay, and that really points to the whole issue that is always the elephant in the room, and that is liabilities. This regulation specifies that network owners and operators can be held liable if, during a future project, this information about where this new infrastructure was installed is not accurate. Now, that is maybe what the law says. In practice, something else very often happens that's different. And that is that you're dealing with a small contractor up against a large utility. And a large utility has a lot of lawyers, a small contractor doesn't. And so in practice, what actually happens is that almost invariably the contractor is held responsible. And we'll come back to that. Another example is Colorado, and this is a bit different. And I think this is one of the things that we're going to see increasingly around the world. In one-call centers in North America and other places in the world, you're required to call the one-call center 3 days before the construction contractor or the excavator puts a shovel in the ground. Not before design, not during planning, but 3 days before you put the shovel in the ground. So you're doing all your design blind. You have no idea what utilities are out there. You design as if it's greenfield, that there's nothing else has been out there before. And this is what I think is really remarkable about the Colorado legislation, is that it requires a subsurface utility engineering survey prior to design. That means that you have to know where things are to ASCE quality level B, which means using remote sensing technology prior to design. So instead of just sending the survey crew out and finding out all the above ground stuff, you also now have to know where all the below ground stuff is before you do design. And this is going to dramatically reduce the number of unnecessary and expensive relocations of utilities. So that is really a groundbreaker. This is another groundbreaker. Ofwat is the water regulator. This is the economic regulator for the water industry in England and Wales. And every 4 or 5 years, they do a comprehensive review of prices and rates for the water industry. PR19 is the most recently. It was done last year. And it has been very aggressive at targeting a reduction in leakage. Over the last 2 decades in the UK, leakage really hasn't changed much. And so this is really this is intention. The intention of this new rule setting in the UK is to dramatically reduce leakage. And it provides a financial motivation to improve the quality of their asset location data. And this is a quote from Richard Broom, who recently wrote an article in a magazine called WWT, which is water and wastewater in the UK. That what this means is that when third parties hit water utility infrastructure, it is going to be a problem for the water network operator or owner. Water network operator owners are responsible for problems with their infrastructure, and there are financial penalties when customers lose water, or the water is brown, or the pressure drops. That costs the utility company, not only the customer, but also the utility. It costs the utility penalties. And what they have done is extend that to include damage by third parties. So construction contractors, not working for the water company, hitting underwater utilities, probably because they don't have good information about where those utilities are underwater. So this is a game changer, and this is going to change the water industry in the UK, and this could change. And if this is picked up by other regulatory agencies around the world, including the UK, this could be a major game changer. But because it motivates utility operators and owners to improve the quality of their information, including location about underground assets. This is a voluntary example I mentioned in Scotland. This has been around since 2012. It's been very successful. There is a very great spirit of cooperation in Scotland, which made this project very, very successful. A voluntary approach may not work in other parts of the world. This is just a quick overview of one-call centers in North America. As I said, every state and every province just about has these. It's different from the click system in the Netherlands, for example. The click system in the Netherlands basically relies on as-builts. You contact the click system, you say, this is where I'm going to dig, and within, I think for almost, in 95% of cases, within 24 hours, you'll have access to all the as-builts from all the utilities and telecoms that are operating in that area. In North America, that's not the way it works. You contact the one-call center, and because as-builts are notoriously inaccurate, what typically happens is 7 vans converge on your site using electromagnetic or electromagnetic wands, EML, and ground penetrating radar sensors in some case, and they paint the ground. And it sounds a little bit more labor intensive, which it is, than the click system. It's not as efficient, but it is more reliable than using as-builts. As I mentioned, in the UK, in England, England and Wales actually, there's a line search before you dig system. This is actually a private company. It's owned partly by Pelican Corporation. They don't cover all utilities in the UK, but they cover all the hazardous fuel transmission, gas and oil, and a high percentage of the electric power networks and some other things as well. And they process 2.5 million tickets every year for people wanting to know more information about what's underground. This is the click system in the Netherlands. The click system has been around for a long time, I think since the beginning of 2000s. It went online in 2010. And the remarkable thing about this is you can submit a request for information, and within 24 hours, you'll have all the as-builts for that area available digitally. So it's really quite a remarkable achievement. Now, this is the elephant in the room that I mentioned, liabilities, and I'll just talk briefly about some of the ways that people try to address this problem in different parts of the world. As I said, there's alternative liability models. The major one in many jurisdictions is the contractor's liable. This is not by law. This is just by the way things work. Small, as I said, the construction industry is fragmented. There's a lot of small contractors, and for a small contractor to go up against a big utility is usually considered to be a waste of time. And so in most jurisdictions, not always, there are some cases where a large contractor will take a utility to court. Recently in San Francisco, there's a $500 million suit in California. But in most cases, the contractor is liable. And this applies in the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and other places. In France, there's what's called a network owner contractor shared liability model, where there are rules that say that if the location of the asset that was struck is accurate and was reported accurately, then it's the contractor's responsibility. If it was not reported accurately and the contractor hit it, then it may be shared 50% to the contractor, 50% to the owner. Or if it was really unreliable, then the network owner is totally responsible for the liabilities. I'll talk a little bit about Montana and Calgary, where there's an attempt to make a shared liability problem. But again, these are North American jurisdictions, and the reality is often that the contractor is responsible. And there was a very interesting proposal, which I don't know whether it was implemented or whatever, in Brisbane, in Queensland, where basically the contractor that put the infrastructure in the ground, working for a network operator, submitted as-built. And then when anybody else came and worked in that area, those same as-built would be provided to those contractors. And if that contractor found that they had problems or whatever, then the original contractor could be sued for the problem. In other words, the network operators weren't involved, really. It became a legal problem between two contractors. It's an interesting idea, but as I said, I don't know whether that was actually implemented. State of Montana. So this is really a big thing, and this is something similar to what has happened, not mandated in Singapore, but it's something to what has happened by basically de facto in Singapore. And the most important aspect of it is as-built have to be certified by a PE or PLS, professional engineer, in other words, a professional. And when you say certified by a professional, that means they can be sued, and that means liabilities. And the law in the state of Montana, the rules also says that network owners, operators could be held liable if their data is inaccurate. Now, as I said, in practice, it may be different. The law sounds good. It sounds like, great, we can take, the network operator say, okay, that's my fault. I have to take responsibility for it. The reality is that often the onus still remains with the contractor. City of Calgary has something similar. Many years ago, they passed a law that said any underground work in the city had to result in the submission of as-built drawings to the city with a specified accuracy and according to the Canadian standards for quality. It provided for inspections by the city and specified shared liability models based on how accurate they were and these as-built were and whatever. Again, as in practice, what actually happened may not be what you might expect by looking at the bylaw. Now, one of the most interesting things that I think is happening these days is open data. This has affected water more than anything else, but it is beginning to affect other things. And I'll give you a really interesting example for oil and gas in Colorado, and also what's happening in the city of Rotterdam. So this was the result of the Firestone disaster, because that was a flow line from a natural gas fracking well in Colorado. And there's something like 17,000 miles of flow lines, what are called flow and gathering lines in Colorado. And the really interesting thing that as a result of that, legislation made the COGCC responsible for collecting data about the location of the things, not highly accurate, to something like, I think something or 25 feet, something like that. But the most remarkable aspect of this was that this data is publicly available on a map. If you're interested, I can send you a link and you can go in there and see all the flow and underground flow and gathering lines in the state of Colorado, which is remarkable. And I think it could be a model for other places just to adopt as well. And this is what I mentioned about the city of Rotterdam, where they are creating an open digital twin of the entire city, and includes both above ground and below ground. And this was the objective of the Iceberg project in the UK, for example, to make sure that underground infrastructure was included in the digital twins of London and other cities in the UK. The interesting thing about Rotterdam is that this is open data and it's based on open standards and publicly available. So that's open data. Another aspect of this is reliable statistics, and this is really a big problem because, as Peter Drucker said, if you can't measure it, you can't fix it. And I'll give you some examples where you say, well, we've done all these wonderful things, and we think we're reducing the number of incidents of underground damage and the total cost of underground damage. And the fact is that often the statistics show that that is not what's happening. So I mentioned PHMSA before. This is the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration in the United States. And their statistics, which are, they're kind of interesting because they have these HCA designation, but it's a way that they can prorate their statistics to something that gives you some idea of construction activity and miles of gas pipeline. And this in the U.S., the PHMSA statistics show that has been no, in spite of everything that PHMSA has done, there has been no reduction in damage. The Ontario Regional Common Ground Alliance, Ontario is a province of about 10 million people. They collect very good statistics. You can see stuff here. The yellow line is the interesting thing, and that's the damages per 1,001 call notifications. And you can see since 2014, there really hasn't been any improvement in that statistic. This is Heathrow Airport, in contrast, where they have the green line gives you some indication of construction activity at Heathrow, and the yellow line shows you since about 2001, 2002, the number of incidents of underground damage resulting from excavation. You can see it has steadily declined. Common Ground Alliance, which covers all of the U.S., for example, this is from 2018, and this shows, the blue shows construction activity, the yellow and the green lines basically show the damages, and if you prorate those two, you'll find that the damages per $1 million of construction is actually increasing in the United States. So this is an example where you think you're doing a lot, but the statistics are actually showing that you really haven't achieved your objective. And I'll mention I'll mention CLIC in the Netherlands, where you can see there's some very interesting statistics that are collected because it's mandatory to report incidents, 759 notifications every year, 41,000 incidents, and you can see the total number of costs and costs per incident. And the statistics show so far that the CLIC system has not reduced utility damage and excavation. It's had some other remarkable achievements, but it has not reduced underground damage during excavation. So I think the conclusion is there's no silver bullet. And if you look at what's happened in Japan, where there has been a comprehensive program since 1985, which has resulted in this remarkable low number. I won't go through all of these things, but it involves construction contractors, it involves network operators, it involves governments, it involves all stakeholders in people building, constructing, and maintaining underground infrastructure. You can see the same thing in Heathrow. Here's another way to look at their statistics, but it's the same thing. A comprehensive program, 7-step process, involves mandatory reporting, it involves safe digging using exclusion zones, and trading. People have to be certified and trained for people who are involved in underground mapping. There are several national initiatives that are underway, and I've already mentioned a couple of them, to try to do something at a national level to implement something to reduce underground damage. I mentioned the RODIC initiative in Japan, Road Information Center, starting in 1985, that has dramatically reduced the number of incidents in Japan. The National Underground Asset Registry initiative in the UK, funded by the Geospatial Commission. There's been 2 pilots up to date in New England, in Northeast England and Central London. It's also been supported by the Project Iceberg that I mentioned to you already. And these are remarkable because of the degree of cooperation. I think altogether it was something like 40 utility operators and government agencies that came together to share information. And probably the most important part of this initiative was the development of a legal framework and legal data sharing agreements between all the parties. And the actual implementation of the pilot technology for this ensured what is called data protection, which is absolutely essential if you want telecoms to be involved, because telecom is a very competitive information, and they don't want this to be used for their competitors to find out where their network facilities are. And this project was successful in bringing in telecom operators and utility operators and government agencies to sit at a table and share information. So This is really a remarkable effort, and they're in the process right now of trying to turn this into a tender, an invitation to tender for a national system for England and Wales. Of course, you're aware of the Singapore Digital Underground, as I mentioned right at the beginning. I think this is a remarkable effort. I really congratulate Victor Hu and the Singapore Land Authority for this, because this is really this is the way it should be done. Developing a comprehensive approach to managing underground infrastructure. I mentioned previously, France was one of the earliest ones to do this in about 2012. My alarm going off there. In about 2012, there's a presidential decree. Basically, it left it up to the département to do this, but it intended to cover all urban areas by 2019 and all of France by 2026. France is very centralized, so this stuff is probably feasible in France, and it would be much more difficult to do otherwise. But it does include liability models and ways of sharing the cost of improving the quality of underground infrastructure, which differs from the liability models that are used in other jurisdictions. So just some of the key elements that I've found over the years. You can find something like 25 recommendations I've made in the white paper that Rob mentioned at the beginning of the GITA site, and Rob shows this where you can download that. But as I mentioned during this talk, you need to have reliable statistics. You need to know what the situation is now and whether these programs that you implement actually do something. I haven't talked about technical at all during this but there have been some remarkable technical advances, both in detecting underground things and online cloud-based systems, mobile-based systems for sharing the information in the field, collecting data during construction, and so on. You need policies, procedures, regulation, business processes to improve the accuracy and timeliness and completeness of as-built. You need to have more sustainable design, which in other words, when you design, you need to know where your underground utilities are. That's one of the remarkable things that Colorado has done. There has to be a high degree of collaboration between the network operators, the consulting engineers, contractors, and projects. Basically, all stakeholders in the construction project have to be involved. The construction industry has been very slow in digitalizing, and so one of the things that really has to happen is digitize. And as mentioned, there's companies that do this. Locust Fuel, for example, is a really good example. But there's a ProStar Corporation in Colorado has done it. GeoWorks in Montana is ways of digitalizing the capture and sharing and updating of location information. Data protection is essential. If you're going to get telecom involved, you have to have data protection because anybody who's involved in a competitive information cannot have access to this information to be used for competitive purpose. It has to have access to all stakeholders during construction, during design, throughout the whole project lifecycle, including operate and maintain. As I've mentioned from the beginning, the elephant in the room is a liability model for sharing the responsibility for cost, for improving the data, but also cost when something's hit. Training and education is essential, and it's one of those things that is often neglected. In North America, just about anybody can go out and do locate. As I mentioned, in Japan, there's certification requirements. Heathrow Airport, there's education and training certification requirements as well. And of course, there's got to be a viable business model for supporting all of this. Who is going to pay for locate operations, whether it's a one call center or however you do it? Somebody has to foot the bill. It could be government, it could be network operators, it could be contractors or excavators. Everybody has a different model for doing that. But these are just some of the things that are required to do these. And as I mentioned partly through this talk, there's no silver bullet. There's no magic technology that's going to solve all these problems. There's going to be technologies that will make it easier to collect information about the location of things during construction. So And there's companies already doing that. That means it doesn't add to construction costs. It does not affect your completion dates or whatever. So that is a dramatic improvement in technology that makes it possible to do some of these things that are mentioned here. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope this has contributed to your understanding of what some of the things that are being done around the world. As I said, I didn't attempt to talk about the technology at all, but I think it is remarkable that the awareness now has really stretched to just about every jurisdiction in the world, and people are doing very creative things to capture and share and improve the quality of underground information. So thank you very much.
I don't think.
All right. I was talking to myself, and let me restart. So again, thank you very much, Geoff. This was fantastic, a very insightful overview, I believe, of the various initiatives overall. I think it's quite important and very relevant to have an insight about what is happening across the different regions, and what are also the lessons learned, and how can we pass the lessons from one initiative to another. We often see that various government initiatives and also private initiatives often reinvent the wheel and possibly recreate some of the strategies and methodologies that have been already potentially developed elsewhere. So I'm also glad that SLA is taking initiative to, first of all, understand what is the landscape and develop a system that is building on previous experiences. So thank you very much. What I'll do, I will, in the meantime, share a poll with everyone, which is asking a question to the audience: who should be responsible for the accuracy of underground utility information? And while everybody is answering the poll, I will maybe add a couple of comments on what has happened in the chat. Thank you very much for everyone to participate to some of these conversations. I've seen some of the comments about the legal implications of sharing or not sharing the data, especially in the context of privacy and GDPR. And also, someone has mentioned that all these lack of data and accident make the lawyers make most of the money in the construction industry. Somebody also mentioned that the lawyers should have actually responsibility to reduce the number of litigations. Geoff, what do you think about this? Do you have any observations with this regard?
Well, this is a very interesting question. I think the really, the interesting thing about what's happened in Montana and to a certain, and in Singapore, like I said, it's not mandatory in Singapore, but it's contractual. And given the very large presence of government in Singapore, when URA or Singapore Land Authority puts something like this into a contract, it has serious implications. And so basically in Montana and Singapore, as-built have to be certified by a professional. Yeah. And what that means is that it means litigation is possible and you can sue a professional. If you say it has to be done by a GIS person, or it has to be done by a city engineer, by a city employee, maybe a GIS city employee or whatever, those people are not suable. And that means it does not impact litigation. And as I said at the beginning, construction is a litigation industry, as you said, Jakob. It's adversarial, and people in the construction industry really would like to change that culture. But the reality is it's a fragmented industry, it's adversarial, and litigation is the rule of the day. A young engineer that I know of who embarked on his first big project He was told by an experienced professional that he spent 3 years doing design and working on the construction, and then he'll spend 3 years preparing the court case. And that's not a joke, and that's not funny. That's not just a way out example. That is typical. I don't know whether making the lawyers responsible for the quality of things. That's not the kind of things that lawyers do, but it certainly suggests, like I said, in certain jurisdictions, it does appear that surveyors and professional engineers are being made liable for this. Now, I have to also add that it is now possible with the new technology that's out there, and I mentioned ProStar, Locust View, GeoWorks, and whatever, where you can collect very accurate data with a handheld, usually right now supplemented by RTK, in the field during construction with no cost, with basically no additional cost for the construction contractor and no impact on schedules. Now that is going to change things, okay? And then we get into the thing of, well, should that information be at least reviewed by a professional surveyor or a professional engineer, so that somebody is responsible for it? Just having a construction crew out there using that technology to capture that information may not solve the problem because of the litigation aspect of it. Oh yeah, so you collected this with your handhelds, so what? I mean, what does that mean? Right? But if it's something where a surveyor or a professional engineer sends somebody out the field to collect the information, then reviews the information, and then signs it, that will probably be the solution to this problem. Because of the nature of the business, somebody has to be suable.
I think what excites me is that there is this opportunity actually for unlocking a lot of value within the construction industry. It's out there, hidden. It's probably hidden under the full life cycle cost, or within the litigation cost, or cost of risk as well. I think there is so much value that could be unlocked if we had the right processes, procedures, accurate data, and I think it will take some time to get there, but this transparency of cost actually, I believe, will drive people to make the right decisions on how to allocate costs, because they don't necessarily predict the cost to be allocated to the court or to the risk. They try to reduce the cost in design, in surveying, in gathering information ahead of construction,
right?
And they don't understand that actually that cost will be multiplied potentially tenfold later on in case of any disaster will happen later on.
Yeah, Jakob, I think you've caught it very well. You have to find a way to improve the quality of underground information without seriously impacting cost.
So we have the first question with regards to the discussion, which is who should be responsible for the accuracy of underground utility information. And you can see the results of the polls, as 40% of people said it should be utility and network asset owners, 35% said licensed professionals should be responsible for the accuracy, and other options were less specified here. So what do you think should be happening here in the construction industry? Who should be liable, Geoff? What is in your view? You mentioned the fact that owners are typically being mentioned as liable for the information. This is the intention, but then you also mentioned that actually what happens because of the less resources in terms of the lawyers and capabilities, smaller contractors actually take the hit most of the time. So who do you think should be liable? Who do you think should be responsible?
Well, I think again, this requires a comprehensive approach. I don't think you can just pick one and say these guys are going to do this and everybody else can just go business as usual. I think it definitely includes utility network owners. I think there has got to be policies put in place that that encourage them to improve the quality of their asset. It also reduces their cost. You know, this is the interesting thing. It benefits the utility network operators to know where their stuff is. When you have an outage and you don't know where the equipment is, that adds significantly to the length of time it takes you to reduce that outage. It's sometimes it's hard to find where it is. It's hard to worry. You have to worry if you have to go and dig to access your stuff. You may hit other utilities while you're doing that, and if you knew where they were, I mean, it could dramatically improve outage management for utilities. I think licensed professionals, like I said, given the litigation structure in many countries, I think licensed professionals have to be involved in some way. But I don't think you can have a survey crew on site at every construction location, or every time you have to do road work that you have to have a licensed professional standing by. I think it has to be the licensed professional together with the new technology together that would make it efficient to collect accurate data about what's underground. I think national mapping agencies have a role to play. I think Ordnance Survey has played a big role in the newer initiative in the UK. I think ultimately, you know, having a national underground asset registry like what's going on in the UK is a good idea. But whether it has to be owned by the government or mandated by the government or be a private initiative sponsored by the government, there's a lot of different ways to do that. So I think all those answers are correct, I guess, is what I would say.
So you're saying it's an ecosystem effort. You mentioned at the beginning something quite important. I think the social effort. It's not individual stakeholders that should be held responsible for the process that by nature is complex. You have a number of individuals that are responsible for maintaining asset registry, asset data. Other professionals would be contracted to either harvest or capture a particular set of data. Other people would be responsible for leveraging that data and then handing over later on. So it's an ecosystem of responsibilities. Would you say it's the case? Would you have any?
Yes, I think that's a very good way. It's an ecosystem of responsibilities. There is no silver bullet. You can't just go to the network operator and say, make your data better, right? Because then the construction contractors also have a responsibility. You know, in the case of Heathrow, for example, where you have accurate as-built, you know where things are underground. When you're digging, and I think it's also true in Japan, when you're digging within, say, 50 centimeters or a meter of a known asset, you have to use safe digging. Sometimes it means you have to use hand tools. Sometimes it means you have to use vacuum or hydraulic excavation and so on. It involves everybody. Like I said, the government has a role. Network operators have a role. Construction contractors have a role. Surveyors and licensed professionals have a role. I think ecosystem is a very good way to put it.
It strikes me that in the initiatives that I've been involved so far, and generally when we talk about digital transformation of the various assets, what I realized that not a lot of say owners of these initiatives necessarily map all the stakeholders in a unified process ahead of redistributing responsibilities and maybe redesigning the process properly. So maybe, because we're all looking for silver bullets, would you think that maybe understanding an ecosystem properly, mapping it up, and also understanding what is the potential cost allocation, ideal allocation of costs in terms of the and liabilities as well across the different stakeholders, and maybe looking at understanding how this cost will be redistributed if there is not enough investment in one particular phase of another. Would this be a potential approach for making sure that we have enough transparency of what type of data is required and where is the actual risk sitting, where the risk can be mitigated most efficiently?
Yeah, I think it's essential to have an economic model of who's paying for what, basically a business model for this, because I think any policy or change in business practice or mandated requirement that adds additional cost to construction contractors will not work. Construction contractors' margins are so low that you have to either reduce risk so you can reduce their insurance costs, or you have to make sure that what they have to do really doesn't add to their costs. Because in the case of network operators, I think network operators, they can go to the regulator and make a rate case and say, we have to improve the quality of our information about the underground, which is what's going to happen in the water industry in the UK. And they will say, we'll need additional resources for investment to improve the quality of underground. And they'll get it. It'll cost us, it'll cost the ratepayers something. But I think in the long run, it's going to reduce costs. So it's one of those things that, it can reduce. It will look like it's increasing rates in the short term, but in the long term, it's going to lead to reduced rates. And that's something that regulators understand.
So we're also looking into not just cost redistribution, but also potentially profit redistribution.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, as you mentioned, it's just a redesign of a business model and an ecosystem on how the value flows across parties. If we were able to understand how does it really, how the ecosystem is mapped for the utilities, around the utilities, construction and maintenance, that I think would be a great starting point. And generally, even if it's not the starting point yet, for many of the initiatives, I think that there will be value, understand how can we most efficiently. I think also spotting the opportunities for the contractors, maybe new opportunities in adding additional services to their portfolio. So I have a question here from the audience. Talked about open data. You mentioned about open data, some of the initiatives there. There is a question about terrorism. I think this question actually can be extended to general availability of data. Maybe also we mentioned that some telco companies, especially for the asset register in the UK, made sure that the privacy is concerned is being addressed, making sure that the data flows to the right parties for the right sake. So the terrorism as well fits into that picture, I believe. What is your comment here?
Yeah, I know often privacy is often the word that is used, but I tend to like the word data protection. And data protection can mean different things. In the case of telecom operators, for example, involved in Newer, data protection means that their competitors can't use the information available through Newer or through any of those prototypes to find out about what their competitors are doing. It's not, telecom is a very competitive business. And if you know that your competitor has just put a whole bunch of fiber into an affluent neighborhood over there, which will generate a lot of revenue, and you want to know what their time frame is for doing that because you have to go over there. This is very useful competitive information. Now, you also mentioned terrorism. In the United States, there's something called the Critical Infrastructure Protection. This was passed about a year after 9/11 in the U.S., and it basically said that any utility operator, telecom operator, could voluntarily submit their data to the CIP, Critical Infrastructure Protection Program. And what it meant was that data was then no longer available to anybody except the Critical Infrastructure Protection Program. It could not be used in civil litigation suits. It could not be accessed through freedom of information. It was basically in a black box where nobody could get at it. And I'm not sure that people believe that's a good thing. It's like this. It's always this thing. Does 99.99% of the population suffer because we're worried about potentially what 0.0001% of the population will do? And I'll tell you honestly, I'm not sure how much of this information is very difficult to get. A number of years ago, the EIA, which is the Energy Information Administration in the US, published an article, it's publicly available, saying that you could take out something, I can't remember if it was on the order of 6 or something like that, substations, which are all visible from the air. You could look on Google, you can see substations from the air. You can't hide these things. But you take out 6 of those, 60% of the United States would not have electric power. So, I mean, you know, I just don't know how, you know, classifying this information, given that we have satellites that can measure things to 30 centimeters, 20 centimeters now, I just don't think it's practical to hide that information. And so I understand that we need data protection for certain things, and I think with the security capabilities of modern software, that is entirely feasible.
I guess that regard, I think we also need to think about redundancy and resilience planning, and this applies to any disaster planning, including water infrastructure, especially through to the coast, close to the coastlines. That's another subject, maybe for another webinar.
Yeah, that's a whole, cybersecurity is a whole nother area. I didn't want to touch on it because you can go on forever, but cybersecurity is critical. I mean, when you looked at what has happened in the Ukraine, what the Russians have done in the Ukraine to basically take down the entire electric network there several times, you know, you can see what's feasible these days. So cybersecurity is really critical. But as you said, it's a whole nother talk.
So, Geoff, I have a result here about the question, which is, which of the following do you see having the greatest impact to data capture and sharing? So, government mandated capture and sharing. So you've mentioned a number of mandates, centrally driven approach, regulation, policy, ban collaboration between utilities and government, and private run data capture and sharing. So which of the following do you see having the greatest impact to the data capture? At the moment, regulation seems like a winner amongst our participants. What is your view on that?
I think, it's interesting that most of the things I mentioned, not all of them, but most of them began with legislation. If you look at Colorado, if you look at Montana, if you look at the UK, if you looked at Japan, those big initiatives, and I'd include Heathrow, they began with legislation, but I think the way a lot of that legislation was actually implemented was through regulation. So in a sense, regulation is government mandated. Regulators are supposed to represent the public. They're not supposed to represent the government. They're supposed to be our representation of, you know, this is what we want to see happen to the water industry, electric power industry, to make things better for us as the public. But it's, you know, you need to have some legislation like a Clean Water Act, or you have to have something in the first place that allows you to do the regulation that sets up the regulatory agencies and so on. So I kind of see government mandate and regulation going hand in hand. I think collaboration between utilities and government is essential. This is not something the government can do and the utilities say, well, maybe we'll participate, maybe we won't. I think that's the model that is one of the really big achievements of the newer initiative, is getting that collaboration between utilities and government agencies. And I think really it has to be extended to include government contract, to include contractors. There's 3 major parties involved in this, and maybe you could include professionals as a 4th. You know, professional engineers, professional surveyors, government, network operators, and construction contractors. And Japan and Heathrow has shown that you need to have all parties involved in solving this problem.
Indeed, I think the poll is actually suggesting to specify the most impactful one, but I could almost see it as in a sequence. You know, it starts with the government, with an assessment of need, recognition of that need. I think you mentioned that actually the awareness about that need is becoming more and more prevalent around the world. But then it needs to result in some sort of regulation and a mandate. And I've seen in other areas of the transformation where mandates were quite effective in stimulating the ecosystem in taking action.
Yes.
And this initial stimulus will drive the collaboration between utilities and the government, which by default will result in also private participants to collaborate and chip in. As far as we have this ecosystem mapped, as it goes back to understanding who are the players, how the value can be redistributed, and who has the biggest stake, so to speak.
Yeah, I think you put it very well. I think you need government policy. You need to have that implemented through regulation, and then you have to have collaboration between the private sector, contractors, utility operators to make it actually work.
Mm-hmm. And any initiatives should probably tackle the different levels and should not discount any of these levels. Otherwise, each of these weak links could actually prevent the value to be realized, I believe.
Absolutely. I think if you leave any of those folks out, and that includes surveyors and professional engineers, if you leave any of those groups out, I don't think you're going to solve the problem.
So, Geoff, I have a question here. We have 3 more minutes. There is a question from Karsten, who also prizes you for excellent overview.
Thank you, Karsten.
He asked, before we improve accuracy, we need to find a way to assessing how good, bad data currently is. So it's about assessment of data. His question is, how can we assess what do we currently have? Have you seen
that? Is real. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, have you seen any initiative that address this particular need or problem?
Yeah, that is a really good point, because I generally say as-built are unreliable, but the quality of as-built varies dramatically in the world. In Japan, they're accurate to 10 to 20 centimeters. They're certainly not accurate to 10 or 20 centimeters in North America. In North America, you may not even have as-built showing the right road that the pipe or cable is going down. It can be off by 250 meters in North America. So we're not talking about 20 centimeters. Heathrow, you're talking about 10 to 20 centimeters, probably even better than that. And so being able to do something to give you an assessment of how reliable your information is in your utility GIS or in your national map or what have you, I think is really an important first step. And I think I really congratulate Karsten for bringing that point up. I think there's ways to do that. This does not mean you have to go survey every kilometer of underground infrastructure you have. This can be done statistically. You can do a random sample. I know that this happened in Brazil quite a while ago, where they basically went out and just looked at their assets and did basically random surveys, randomized surveys, what a better way to put it, randomized surveys. You say, okay, I'm going to take this particular area, I'm going to get the map from the utility of showing what they go out, and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to use GPR, I'm going to use EML, I'm going to find out what is actually out there, and I'm going to compare that. It was actually done in Milan. There was a project in Milan quite a while ago that where ground penetrating radar was used very successfully to look at what was underground and compare that to the actual records. And it was incredible how much information was not in the records, missing from the records, how much information was inaccurate, and how much information, and then varying levels of accuracy. So I think Karsten has hit on something that every jurisdiction should really consider. Get some idea of how reliable your as-builts are, and then you can start figuring out the best approach, and you can begin triage. It may be certain districts are very accurate. I know this was the case in Australia with some of the telecom stuff. There's some districts the data is very accurate. Other districts it was wholly inaccurate. And you need to know that before you can actually start putting a budget, putting a budget together to say, well, what can we do to try to address this problem?
Thank you. So before we close, I wanted to ask a question. You mentioned about um, these being a social effort to improve equality, but we also talked about the organizational effort. So my question is, how do you think the organizations should organize themselves internally to improve data quality? And maybe if you can hear it between the small enterprise, middle, medium enterprise, and bigger enterprise, which would include potentially the agencies as well. Could you give any insights of how organization can actually start today, right now, practically, with some key practices to improve data quality?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think that if I were a network operator, I would look at what Montana's doing, but I would temper that with the new technology which allows data to be captured in the field with a handheld. By the end of the year, you will be able to get centimeter accuracy on a handheld without RTK. Now that's going to be remarkable. That means anybody out in the field will be able to collect centimeter accuracy. But I think you have to have oversight by a professional. Because of the nature of construction, you have to have that professional involved in it. But it doesn't mean the professional has to be out in the field. So this is something that can be implemented without significant additional cost to the construction contract, the excavator, but can collect centimeter accurate data. I mean, for network operators and for contractors, I think that is something they can do immediately, to start looking at those technologies. There's a number of companies that do that. I've mentioned several of them. There's another one that I haven't mentioned, AVUS, which was one of the first to allow you to go and take a video of something you've just put in a ditch before you cover the ditch. You just walk along with your handheld, take a video of it, you upload it to a cloud site, and you've got centimeter accurate as-built. That is entirely possible, but I think the key is that you've got to put it in the framework of how the construction industry works, and that's why I think professionals need to be involved in that. From the government point of view, I think doing what the UK is doing right now, thinking about putting in place either the legislation to require regulations, to set up an organization that regulates, or taking advantage of existing regulatory organizations and promulgating rules that require accurate as-built, and secondly, the capture of any information about exposed utilities during construction. I think if you do those two things, and the things I've mentioned for construction contractors using new technology, that you can really begin to have a significant impact on these things, and not requiring, huge times. I think it's something that people can embark on immediately.
Mm-hmm. I'm conscious we will need to close, but what I wanted to definitely say is that everyone is invited to send us a question as well, and go to the website DUConnect.org as well to comment on the article that will be put together soon as a summary of the session. And before I leave the closure to Rob, I would like to thank Geoff for waking up at 4 a.m. in the morning for us and sharing his insightful stories and experiences from across the world. So thank you again. Rob, over to you.
Also, thank you for moderating this discussion. I'll keep it brief. Let me thank everyone for joining. I've seen a very lively discussion in the chat. Familiar faces, but also new ones, and I think it's really great to have that going on. Geoff, thank you so much. Also from my side, appreciate it a lot that you got up so early for us to give this talk and share your view and your knowledge. I can tell you that I've received a couple of positive comments on my own WhatsApp as well, saying that it's refreshing to even though at the end we do acknowledge that technology is really important, that we talk about the social or the organizational aspect as well. And even though it can be very challenging, it's really important that we consider this as we go forward in making the information quality better. So thank you for giving us this perspective, and thank you to the audience as well for joining us. I really appreciate it. And of course, if you could give us your feedback as well, that always helps us to make things a bit better for the next time around. So thank you so much. And with that, let me close this session and wish you all a good remainder of the day, no matter how long that still is for you. So thank you very much and take care.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Jakob.
Thank you very much.